Hi, everyone. Welcome to tonight's lecture in the SCI-Arc Fall 2018 Evening Lecture Series. Tonight, it's my pleasure to welcome Esther Choi, who has entitled her lecture Rem Brûlée and Other Hits, Social Alchemy as a Spatial Practice. I love this title. It's one of the best lecture titles I've ever heard. Conjuring unlikely couplings of food and architecture, and provoking us to consider what happens when we exchange the drawing table for the dining table? When we combine the space of individual reflection with the collective space of engagement? The table as the site upon which food is placed for consumption and architecture meets in diverse instances. Heinrich Wülflin citing Da Vinci's Last Supper as an exemplar for clearness, a device that locates bodies in space, both literally and metaphysically. Or Ray and Charles Eames selecting the picnic blanket, a more ephemeral and flexible version of the table, of the dining table, as a point of departure from the familiar on their journey powers of 10. One thinks also of Foucault's use of the table. A table, a tabula, that enables thought to operate upon entities of our world, to put them in order, to divide them into classes, to group them according to names that designate their similarities and their differences. The table upon which, since the beginning of time, language has intersected space. Esther Choi's work invites us, once again, to take a seat at the table. So I look forward to hearing about your culinary and architecture combinations. And Esther Choi is an artist, architectural historian, and writer based in New York. Informed by her training in architectural history and theory, her multidisciplinary work approaches the histories and artifacts of the built and managed environments as tools to probe the politics of intersubjectivity and sharing the commons. Choi is the co-editor of 2 books with Marika Trotter, Architecture is All Over and Architecture at the Edge of Everything Else, which are upstairs in our library. Her writing has appeared in many publications, including Art Forum, Art Papers, JAE, Architectural Review, and Pinup. Esther has contributed essays to exhibition catalogs such as Hippy Modernism, The Struggle for Utopia, and Reaper, Richard Hamilton's Siegfried Gideon. Choi has participated in speaking engagements at the Museum of Modern Art, the Cranbrook Art Museum, eFlux, Harvard Graduate School of Design, the Center for Experimental Humanities at NYU, among other venues. Choi has also shot photographs for T, the New York Times style magazine, Dazed and Confused, Another Magazine, Another Man, and Vice Records. After stumbling across an elaborate dinner menu crafted for Walter Gropius in 1937, food became a spatial, social, and sculptural medium for Choi. This lecture will explore the Fluxus-inspired participatory events called Le Corbuffets that Choi began organizing in 2015, seeking to transform the increasingly rarefied activities of commensality and aesthetic connoisseurship into unusual forms of kinship. The project explores how food can be used as a design tool to examine the politics of sharing, while probing and blurring the boundaries between art, design, and everyday life. A conceptual cookbook based on these events, entitled Le Corbuffet, will be published by Prestol in 2019. Choi holds degrees from Princeton University, Harvard University, Concordia University, and Ryerson University. Her dissertation explores the visions of social change that informed exchanges and collaborations between British architects, biologists, writers, and artists in the period between and following the 2 world wars. So please join me in welcoming Esther Choi to SCI-Arc.
Hello, SCI-Arc. Thanks for such a nice introduction. Okay, so the project I'm about to talk about revolves around questions I've had pertaining to the objectives of historical investigation as both a professional field, but also as a tool for political engagement and for critical inquiry. So I operate sort of both as an artist. So I came to the GSD about 10 years ago, having finished my MFA. And in the last 7 years, I've sort of, I guess, been more known in the field of architecture as an architectural historian in training and as a critic or a writer. So I'm sort of fluidly moving in between these different identities and domains. But this is a project that sort of, I'll tell you about, that sort of, in which all of these identities start to commingle in strange ways. And so I really want to ask and put the question forth, like, are there ways to bring in the artifacts of history, both literally and figuratively, as theoretical tools to understand and change the present moment? Okay, so I'm going to begin with this slide. So sometimes the universe sends you hints and nudges in the form of unexpected gifts. So in 2014, I found myself sitting in this concrete bunker designed by the British architect Dennis Lasden, sorting through an enormous parcel of paper. And my August days had been spent in archives searching painfully for clues for my dissertation. Research for my doctorate degree in architectural history had taken me to very unexpected places, and this week at the University of East Anglia in Norfolk was really no exception. So imagine my amazement when, monotony interrupted, I discovered this elaborate menu. Designed by the Hungarian artist Laszlo Moholy-Nagy, the multi-panel bill of fare was for dinner in honor of Walter Gropius, the famed German modernist architect and Bauhaus school founder. Gropius and his family were about to leave London, and like other European modernist architects in 1937, he and his family had been living in exile, avoiding Nazi occupation, narrowly escaping a fate that unfortunately many others did not. So he just accepted a prestigious job at the Harvard Graduate School of Design and was about to leave. So this event marked both an end and a beginning, at once concluding a period of great uncertainty and transience for the architect, and the start of yet another chapter of life as immigrants in a foreign country anew. And, you know, sorry, the slide's a bit low resolution, but I began to see Gropius in a new light, in the way that food can operate as an index of social status, cultural taste, lifestyle, and class privilege. It allowed me to render a different portrait of a man deemed a genius by most art and design textbooks. Now, the menu featured an array of British and French fare, which I'm not sure you can read. So I'll just go through it quickly. Oysters, turtle soup, cheese straws with tio pepe, boiled Scotch salmon, lobster and cucumber with a pouille, a volnay served with Aylesbury duckling, applesauce, French beans, roast potatoes, and salad, iced nectarine melba with petit fours, finished with fruit, port, cheese, and brandy. As much as the menu revealed the cultural assimilation required of the Gropiuses to survive in England and later the United States, it also brought their immense privilege into plain view. Britain's intellectual and artistic literati, which you can see from this guest list, partook in a very glamorous evening of gastronomic indulgences that night, far from the typical diet of the average person during a period of interwar rations. So this strange and quite beautiful artifact led me to realize that food performs in particularly unique ways, revealing aspects of our society and its structures through subtler means. Now, certainly its relatively low cost and accessibility have made it a preferred medium for artists and designers, especially ones engaged in social and cultural commentary. From the artist-run Soho restaurant Food, devised by Goodden, Tina Girouard, and Gordon Matta-Clark in the early 1970s. The feminist collective Womanhouse, their immersive domestic installation of a dining room in 1971. Haus-Rucker-Co's edible architectural models for their Food City events, also in the early 1970s. And more recently, Rirkrit Tiravanija's pad thai served to museum and gallery goers. In all of these instances, food has prompted new ways to understand and challenge the place of aesthetics in the politics of everyday life. For lodged within the quotidian rituals of commensality are, I think, profound questions about the nature of human existence. Consider, for example, Alison Knowles' Fluxus performance in Identical Lunch from 1969, in which the artist visited the same luncheonette in Chelsea, New York, at the same time, and order the same daily spread. A tuna fish sandwich on wheat toast with lettuce and butter, no mayo, and a large glass of buttermilk or a cup of soup. I don't understand the buttermilk, but okay. She came to think of the lunch as a performance and published an event score. And reenacted by others, the range of experiences produced by the same meal revealed the work's main philosophical gambit, that no object in human experience is identical to itself. Likewise, I think the rituals of food consumption reveal the basic yet profound truth that we're the same but different, alike but also unlike. We all obviously must eat in order to survive, yet how much and what one eats is anything but universal. As much as food can magnetize relations, it's also a seismograph of privilege. For some, access to food is aplenty. Indeed, some of us have partaken in culinary treks to sample Michelin star or James Beard Award-winning masterpieces, whereas for others, feeding oneself and one's lot is associated with scarcity and strife. This is an observation I made being Canadian, starting school in the GST, but walk into any grocery store, really in the world, assuming the neighborhood even has a grocery store, and you can tell a lot about a neighborhood's demographics. What vegetables or fruit or protein, if any, are available, and how much do they cost? And in an era of commodity production, art and design function in this way too, as modes of creative expression that can be used to question and dismantle barriers. I think they can also effectively produce and reinforce them through their participation in art fairs and privatized channels of market value which limit access. Now, Gropius, like many modernist designers, touted the democratic values of good products available for the masses. Yet their designs are now stored away in museums and private collections, embalmed by the market's insatiable desire for aesthetic consumption. So while creative expression was once regarded an activity as natural as eating, in today's economy, commensality and aesthetic connoisseurship are becoming increasingly rarefied and inaccessible endeavors, subject to the social systems and institutions that separate the haves from the have-nots. So with all this in mind, in 2015, I decided to conduct a social experiment. Inspired by the menu for Gropius's dinner, I wondered, if I recreated this bill of fare for my friends, would I come to some kind of closer understanding through a kind of method acting process, and perhaps even closer understanding and even reconciling the kind of aspirations of the avant-garde artists and designers that I had spent the nearly 20 years studying and disseminating through my own teaching, in relation to the circumstances that afforded them their place in this history. So I envisioned my circle of confidants, arms in the air. With irony, we'd wear monastic cloaks inspired by Johannes Eaton, while toasting merrily to glasses of Tio Pepe. And so I actually did ask around to see if any of my friends would be interested, but I had to face the facts. No one in this day and age wants to eat turtle soup, nor could I actually bring myself to actually deshell a terrapin and boil it. Still, refusing to be dissuaded, I dreamt up a scenario to diffuse some of the pretense surrounding the gastronomic and artistic cognoscente. So in 2015, I organized my first Le Corbuffet, a domestic food situation named cheekily with a feminist wink after the famed modernist and notoriously misogynistic French architect, Le Corbusier. Riffing on the notion of aesthetic consumption, I developed a series of pun-inspired dishes named after canonical works of art and design. So an invitation was sent to 20 people, summoning them to my tiny apartment. So the first event featured a number of dishes which were later included in a compendium called Le Corbuffet, which I'll tell you more about a little bit later in the talk. So for instance, my guests gobbled up plates of Carolee Schneemann meat joy balls, an orgy of juicy, spiced, aromatic lamb kefta piled high over mounds of couscous and roasted vegetables. They marveled over the frank conceptual boldness of a platter of Lawrence Weiners, naked, boiled, and unadorned. Mouthfuls of a Michael Heizer Levitated Mass Pavlova were enjoyed in between giggles, its geological meringue peaks slathered in clouds of featherweight whipped cream. Out of that first Le Corbuffet food event, as well as the subsequent events that followed at varying scales, formed a basic set of principles that have informed how I've come to think about the project and about my approach to creative practice as a whole. The first is that perhaps there is a way to reintegrate the presence of art in everyday life, or arte vita, through cooking, experimentation, and play. Perhaps creativity does not require expensive equipment or rare ingredients. Perhaps there's a way to take what has been done before and call it your own. Perhaps perfection should be regarded with suspicion, and that the best way to begin is just to begin. And perhaps there's something revolutionary, especially in this particular political and economic climate, in the idea that anyone can make anything, especially tools like food, meant for sharing, using everyday ordinary materials. So as the project developed, I began to think of these gatherings as social sculptures that use the rather innocuous medium of food as a tool for a kind of social aggregation. Some of these gatherings didn't involve a designed invitation and elaborate setup of 30 guests. Instead, they sometimes took the form of a dinner that I would prepare of Corbuffet dishes. And it became an exploration in the furtiveness of an artistic gesture, the role of the artist as a chameleon, and the nature of aesthetic consumption as a whole. For instance, did a participant require self-awareness in order to deem their consumption of art a good experience? Here, aesthetics became not about style, that is, the style of food or a sculptural form. For me, the aesthetic of the endeavor adopted a more ephemeral form of alchemical transformation. And in particular, I began to take an active interest in how the politics of hospitality, the art of sharing, can be a platform for a kind of critical and political practice. And in this regard, I think my historical indebtedness to the Fluxus mandate of integrating art in everyday life cannot be understated. And while this notion had a sense of political urgency in the late 1960s, I think this concept adopts a particularly profound valence today. For in these neoliberal times, when privatized and unequal access to the commons has become the norm, I really don't think there's anything simple or straightforward about preparing a meal for one another. The distribution of one's labor and resources, the idea of offering care and time, of thinking of the we rather than the I, of encouraging creative production as a non-specialized activity outside of market channels, this is all sadly becoming a radical proposition. So rather than consider sociability and space strictly through institutionalized channels, through typologies like community centers and urban squares and schools, I want to propose that we apply our design thinking towards everyday objects and that we also consider them seriously as tools for building intersubjective experiences. For like a community center, everyday things like a kitchen and a dinner table can be thought of as an imaginative contact zone for asking questions about how we wish to live together with both human and non-human constituencies, and what conventions or constructions are preventing us from doing so. Relationality, in my view, is as much a spatial issue as a social one. So I see space, or architecture with a capital A, not as a container for social transformations to unfold, but a condition created from and through them. And in this regard, I've been thinking a lot about Joseph Beuys's invocation of social alchemy, an idea he inherited from Rudolf Steiner, which he saw as a necessary ingredient to produce what he called a social architecture, a new living model of a social reality. Tools, that is, everyday objects, held a special role in producing social alchemy for Beuys and for Steiner. Their approach to tools speaks to my own interest in the epistemological function of technological objects and their ability to code rituals, ways of thinking, and modes of experiencing the world. So for Steiner and his acolyte, Joseph Beuys, the prosaic materiality of common objects allowed them to act as instruments to magically transform existing conditions into a new living model of social difference. Now, Rudolf Steiner in particular sought to make the sympathetic relation between the self and the world, an otherwise alchemical force, into a modern medium. His model of a social ecology, appropriated from the natural sciences and visual culture, viewed the sensible world of things generated out of human intuition and imagination, literally everything from biodynamic agricultural practices, paintings, to functional objects like the ones he designed here, as contact zones through which to garner greater awareness of the self in relation to the human or non-human other. Likewise, as a devotee of Steiner's principles, Beuys took up Steiner's call for an alchemy of the everyday through his use of props and sculptures. Chalk, blankets, wax, these were all motifs in his work. And typically they've been interpreted by art historians to convey a collective social vision through the symbolic depiction of processes. But I would argue that on the contrary, they performed a very practical function. As conduits and mediators for the production of new experiences, their use in social gatherings helped to bring different constituencies in relation to produce new centers of gravity. For both figures, social transformation could take place through a collective ritual interaction with familiar objects that comprise the everyday environment. Echoing Goethe's maxim, art is the mediator of the inexpressible. So acting as choreographic objects, a term I borrow from choreographer William Forsythe, food, I think, is masterful in its ability to elicit particular mannerisms, habits, and rituals of participation that are deeply embedded through habituation. So whereas the design objects of Steiner and Beuys have now become rarefied and collectible and out of reach, I'm interested in the use of food as a design object and an aesthetic and functional tool that can allow us to collectively ask questions about the sympathetic relation that's intrinsic to the design of everyday life. And in so doing, my exploration with food hopes to provide a new theoretical way to think about how everyday objects can bring different constituencies, systems, and forces together through their prosaic materiality, a rejoinder to Beuys's call for a social architecture. Okay, so last December, while thinking about the politics of sharing, I wanted to conduct another experiment, what I called an experiment in transmutational sociability. The premise was simple, one based on the parable of stone soup, which I assume you're all familiar with. So using the premise of a Sunday lunch as the pot, I cast the first stone of $130, which I used to make lunch for 30 people. And each invitee was asked to bring canned food, which in turn would be transferred to City Harvest, New York City's largest food rescue organization. And so a few weeks prior to that, I had attended a workshop at City Harvest, during which I learned that it takes literally only $1 to create a meal for a person when cooked in large sums. And the project, well, this particular experiment was also largely motivated by the fact that I lived in Bed-Stuy in Brooklyn, an area with the highest rate of food insecurity in all of New York City, in which 1 out of 3 children are not receiving enough food. So it was a simple gesture, but also one that provided a valuable lesson for me, and one which the documentation of the event can't communicate. That these people fed by me, in turn ended up feeding nearly 3 times as many people by paying it forward. It's a very simple premise that a lot of fundraisers are based on. But here again, aesthetic consumption could be transformed into a form of consumptive production, aligning different constituencies and spaces through the universal attribute of the digestive tract. And just prior to that event, the universe decided to send me another gift. So I had sent an invite from one of my Le Corbuffets to a curator friend, and I received a call from him. He happened to have lunch with an editor at Prestel, one of the oldest art and design publishers in the world. And the editor had been explaining how after the recession, cookbooks were really the only lucrative format. And wouldn't it be great if she could come across a project that somehow triangulated the imprint's interest in art, design, and food. So he showed her the invite. Now, what my friend Carson didn't know is that I had been secretly wrestling with the idea of producing a book and began a proposal, a skill that I had garnered from editing 2 previous books with Rirkrit Tiravanija. And I knew that I somehow wanted to turn the Le Corbuffet project and all my ideas around food into a publication, but I thought of it more as a kind of traditional manifesto or essay. So it was quite serendipitous when I heard from her, but I still wasn't sure of what form it would take. So when the cookbook format was proposed to me, I have to admit, cookbooks were not on my radar earlier. And sure, as an avid cook, I had a lot of them in my possession, but I really never considered them an artistic or even a political format. But it was then that I started to recall an essay written by Seth Price called Dispersion, which is an artwork in the form of an art historical essay. And here's a kind of installation that Seth Price did of the actual printout of the essay, which you can download for free online. And so this essay was released right in 2002, I believe, right when the internet was beginning to show its influence in all facets of culture. And it argued, essentially, that distribution and circulation networks, rather than production, was one of the defining characteristics of how artworks accrue their meaning. And this was really an attempt on the part of Price, I think, to ask the question of how can one enact political change or political intervention in image culture. And you have to imagine that in 2002, it's this sort of like explosion of Tumblrs and like JPEGs everywhere. So his suggestion is to inhabit a given system of cultural production and distribution and work within its constraints and formula. And then this kind of opened up this kind of new world of research around the cookbook as an artistic format. And my cookbook situates itself within a legacy of artworks that adopted the format of the cookbook to explore how rituals can provide a space for play and invention and critical inquiry, to question how and why it is that we do the things that we do. So consider, for example, the Futurist Cookbook from 1932, in which Marinetti rallied for the political possibilities of a low-carb diet. Or consider Salvador Dali's opulently illustrated Ode to Gastronomic Surrealism, Les Dîners de Gala from 1972, which featured an array of sensual delicacies in unusual formats and situations. So I just submitted the manuscript and images of my cookbook, Le Corbuffet, to the editor of Prestel, and the book will be out next fall, designed by Studio Lin, based in New York. And it has 60 recipes following the tradition of punny names, using silliness as a subversive method to talk about aesthetic consumption. So you'll see some of the greatest hits, I think, of architectural history on this list. Mies van der Rohe Dip, Super Studio, as well as some of the biggest hits in art history. And so I should say as a disclaimer, the book is being designed at the moment, so these are all sort of specs. Nothing is sort of set in stone at the moment. But the recipe, though, is approached in a very kind of fluxus sense as a score, much like the Alison Knowles tuna fish sandwich piece. And it's a score that can be reinterpreted or performed or rewritten by participants. But my interest is in developing these recipes is to incorporate food history and art and design history and biographical data. So in the book, I invite the participant to enact the event score and improvise it or rewrite it at will, remixing mediums for maximum sensory, spatial, and social stimulation. Because I see each recipe much like a story or an artwork or a dish or a building. Everything starts with some kind of idea that's often been borrowed and then reimagined to have its meaning and the spirit renewed. And my attempt in these recipes is to nod to the original dishes while allowing, and our art forms, allowing a different kind of creative alchemy to take flight. And so the general formula for every entry is the title, which kind of sets off the relationship between ingredients and kind of like in history and a figure, a brief paragraph that situates the historical figure or work and the idea behind the dish, a list of ingredients, and then the recipe or the event score. So here's an example, which I never can pronounce, but it's yokonomiyaki. Okay, so it's a recipe for okonomi, which is a kind of, some of you probably already know, a kind of Japanese shredded pancake. So in Yoko Ono's 1969 performance, Cut Piece, participants approached the seated artist, adorned in her best suit, and proceeded to cut portions of her garment off with a pair of scissors. And in accordance with the score, a set of instructions written by the artist, participants could keep portions of the garment they had cut. Now, whereas for Ono, Cut Piece was largely a study of how much people will take, the cut in this okonomi recipe performs as an act leading to amassment, adornment, and sharing. So in this recipe, a giant vegetarian pancake is created magically by combining elastic threads of batter, which hold mounds of shredded cabbage, lots of cuts. Once fried, the crispy mound is further decorated with fragments of ginger, seaweed, bonito, and tempura bits. Served communally with scissors, guests are encouraged to snip portions of the pancake to serve to others rather than to themselves. Another example could be the recipe for Super Studio. So, piposo was a peppery beef stew invented by Brunelleschi's laborers during the building of the Florence Cathedral in the 15th century. The builders slow-cooked inexpensive cuts of meat and red wine in the kilns that they used to actually fire the tiles used for the building. So cobbling their resources together, a healthy pile of black pepper and maybe a sprig of rosemary were all that was available to flavor the dish, but it was really all that was needed. So after a day's work, the hearty rich stew, which had been cooking in the kiln for hours and hours, was shared in solidarity amongst the workers. So this version of Piposo translates the recipe as a tribute to Superstudio, the radical 60s architectural collective, also from Florence, who reinterpreted Brunelleschi's penchant for tiles into endless monumental proportions. So zooming into the future, because now in the 60s, tomatoes, garlic, other things are available, the subtler additions of garlic and tomato create a stew that acts as a contemporary reminder of the power of coming together to realize a common goal. So this is sort of the way in which historical information and food availability and all these issues I'm trying to weave them together into these little narratives. So just really quickly to say a few words on the design. One of the, I thought was a great observation from Studio Lin was that, really the two major influences for this project are that of conceptual and process art and also the conventions of food culture. And there's a really interesting typographic parallel between 1960s and 70s conceptual art practices and the documentation of performance art and recipe cards, given that in the late 60s and early 70s, monotype, really typewriters, was the only main form of technology used. Studio Lin has then taken the monotype treatment and updated it. And there's these little moves that they're making, the ingredients are actually, the type is blown up to emphasize the materiality of making and to think about food as a medium of sculptural and social practice. Okay, I wanted to also say a note on method because I've referred to Le Corbuffet as a kind of political project, and I want to explain that a little bit further. The project attempts to play with humor as a vehicle of critical practice by twisting idioms in art, design, and food culture and playing with perceptions. So some of the recipes gamble with puns, while others try to imagine equivalencies between ingredients, materials, and processes. And like event scores, the recipes prompt an engagement with techniques and concepts and formats from the kitchen to the studio and then back again, to explore how simple ingredients can be transformed and assembled and shaped in very economical ways. And I developed an interest in, I guess what I would call alternative forms of criticism while revisiting some of these kind of so-called visionary or radical projects of the late 60s and 70s. In particular, a few years ago, I ended up writing about Haus-Rucker-Co's elaborate antics, often with pneumatics, for a large touring exhibition called Hippy Modernism that was curated by Andrew Blauvelt at the Walker Art Center. And you're probably familiar with their work. They're kind of most well known for their environmental transformers, these prostheses that you could put on and it would activate your senses and help you to kind of experience urban space in a different way. But in my discussions with the members of the collective, I really had a hard time understanding how their work was critical because it seemed so fun. And I think that this is an era of architectural production that has confounded historians for decades, really, particularly because it doesn't seem critical. But through this historical work and my interviews with them, I came to see pleasure as a potentially political act that brings with it its own poetics and problematics. And this, for me, is a different model of criticality rather than the kind of negational or negative experience that we come to associate with resistance, or alternatively, the kind of Freudian technique of unveiling the ills of culture. The project, as a mode of critical practice, situates itself more in relation to the notion of soft power, theorized by Joseph Nye, who was the former dean of the School of Government at Harvard. And originally, Nye used the term soft power in reference to as a term to critique the US government's international relations policy during the Bush Senior's administration. And for Nye, soft power is the ability for cultural production to politically persuade through seduction rather than top-down coercion through legislation. Nye, for example, is known for saying, quote, "The best propaganda is no propaganda." And he speaks in this book to the power of aesthetics in communicating associative sensibilities and affects that can precipitate the atmospheres required for social and political change, the kind of temperament necessary for particular values to be advanced and accepted by the mainstream. So I'd really I'm not like a rep for his publisher or anything, but I would really, really encourage you to read this book because although he did not write it for cultural practitioners, he wrote it as a political theorist, I find it incredibly empowering, especially those of us that are trying to kind of contend with image culture these days and understand architecture's place in it. So another crucial aspect of my interest in soft power is in my own photographic approach. And so I should say a few words on my representational strategy. My goal was explicitly to depict food as reactive, imperfect, volatile, and sculptural. It was also often surrounded by very common, inexpensive domestic objects, and certainly a lot of plastic. And this is a commentary, for me at least, on how food and its relationship to technological production forms the first strata of the Anthropocene, but also really speaks to the everyday domestic context. And in so doing, I'm really interested in communicating a different set of values around food, in contradistinction to representations of nature and food that we see nowadays, especially in platforms like Instagram and mainstream advertising. And I don't know about you, but like my Instagram is like populated with photos of food that look like alien, like perfect weird alien renderings. There's that kind of sheen that is now placed on images of food culture, I think communicates a logic of waste and monetization and expertise. And this kind of composited food reality, which places such a heavy valence on achieving a kind of inaccessible perfection, is one which I think really stems from a very long history of still life, actually in photography and painting, in which nature is associated with domestication, economic abundance, and cultural production. So as much as these just look like sloppy shots of food, I'm very much thinking about my own training as a photographer and about, images of food and the way I've been taught to photograph food and trying to actively work against them. And so in this age of commodity production, I really wanted this project to be an opportunity to look at images of food critically and treat it as an opportunity for some kind of intervention. And it might seem a bit like lofty. I mean, like I'm showing you a picture of peanuts and chicken, but but I really thought of this project, I really took it seriously as an opportunity to reimagine and effectively name the political functions of aesthetics. Because I think by naming and studying its operations, then we can find new languages and methods to resist its soft power. And in fact, I had a conversation with a butcher in Brooklyn at a local grocer, and he thought the notion of photographing imperfect produce and animals was a radical, radical proposition, given the amount of food waste that he's witnessed over the past 10 years. He felt, in particular, that images of food have made people afraid to purchase less than perfect produce, which has huge environmental impacts, and as well, too afraid to cook. And clearly, I mean, we're in the day and age of like boxed meal delivery services with prepackaged spices, like a teaspoon of salt and a teaspoon of pepper, and it's creating this kind of whole culture of, I don't know, sort of like fear of error or something. And so I think in this way, it's a fallacy to consider politics a byproduct or kind of divisible segment of architecture or image production as a whole. And as I see like partaking in any kind of visual or material production an inherently political act through the very function of organizing life. And really, like the material reality that we create constitutes the mesh which holds things in relation and thereby co-constitutes the basis by which subjectivity and thus politics is formed. So really quickly, food began to then converge with some of the more academic events I was asked to participate in. So I was asked to partake in a conversation with Orkan Telhan, an artist and researcher and microbiologist who experiments with growing bacteria. And since the conversation was to revolve around bread, I suggested that I recreate Hans Hollein's bread table from Man Transforms, which was shown at the Cooper Hewitt in 1976. And in this show, bread, among other tools, was displayed as a cultural artifact, showing its many designs around the world. So I sourced roughly 50 different kinds of bread, reflecting various grain varieties, techniques, food histories, chemistries, cultural practices, and microbial states. And then it allowed us to have a kind of different conversation about our microbiome and the politics of food production while ingesting these various critters. So I'm just going to close now with some thoughts of, like, now that the Corbuffet project is sort of wrapping up in a way, at least as a publication. My work with food, which was really not something that I expected to engage in, but my work with food as a social and spatial device has expanded to exploring how it might inform and encourage alternative models of kinship. And more specifically, I've become really interested in the model of kinship closer to what the anthropologist Marshall Sahlins refers to as a mutuality of being, and what that might look like as a set of aesthetic and social practices. Now, at the core of this concept is not simply the idea of community, which is really a kind of recognition of myself in you through a shared goal, but rather, Sahlins describes an arrangement of intersubjective or shared mutuality in which one recognizes and participates in the other's intentions and approaches, especially when it differs from one's own. Food operates as a particularly unique relational device in this regard, socially, spatially, and historically. And I'm quite struck by the example offered by the New Guineans of the Nebular Valley, who are studied by Francesca Merlan and Alan Rumsey. In the Nebular Valley, kinship is formed by sexual reproduction and social engagement through the transmission of what I might be mispronouncing, kopong, which is grease or fat, described as the essential matter of living organisms whose ultimate source is the soil. Now, kopong is a substance that's transmitted in the mother's milk and the father's semen, thus tethering offspring to parents in a manner that's closer to what we know of or think of in terms of bloodlines and genetic heredity. But interestingly, grease is also found in sweet potatoes and pork. Thus, kinship links can be formed by sharing food, by eating together, and eating from the same land. So, as Sahlins notes, in this way, the children or grandchildren of immigrants may be fully integrated as kinfolk, but, for that matter, the offspring of two brothers are as much related because they were sustained by the same soil as because their fathers issue from the same parents. Thus, the capacity of shared food to generate kinship, a model of consumptive production that Marx did not imagine. So I've begun working on a project that explores what alternative forms of kinship, and especially family, might look like, and how these new social forms might operate. And in some ways, this is a response to Edward Steichen's Family of Man project. Now, we tend to think, as I said earlier, of family ties through bloodlines and genetic heredity. But if you think about it, the shared ritual practices like commensality the social and spatial act of aggregation, is also largely how the social contract of commitment, of family commitment, is formed. Now, the adage goes, of course, we don't choose our families, so you have to learn to accept and live with, the members of your family, and just accept them as they are. And indeed, the sense of acceptance that you might bestow to a brother or a sister whose lifestyle or personality or life choices may differ greatly from your own might exceed or fall short of the same respect that you might bestow a neighbor, a colleague, or even a stranger. So I want to pose to you the question, what if we could choose our family members? What if you could choose who you might call your brother or your sister or your mother or your uncle? What type of social agreement would you be bound to? Would you honor such contracts, or would these new family members not be afforded the same sense of social responsibility and tolerance that you may feel towards blood relations? And furthermore, as a challenge to these difficult political times we find ourselves in, what if a stranger was to become your new brother or sister, which is essentially what the model of kinship with Kopong suggests? What if this person had a radically different childhood or socioeconomic status, or different cultural references, clothing, language, and appearance? What new types of shared mutualities would emerge in yourself and in the other from this union? What new obligations or considerations, rituals, negotiations, reciprocities, and poetics might spring forth? What do you think that you could learn from that experience? So my new work involves thinking around the role of ritual and instruments in the forging and maintenance of social contracts, a project which hopefully will develop throughout the year and be exhibited next fall. So I'll just leave it there, that provocation. When I give this talk in a different context, I actually passed around like a cracker and fooled everyone into becoming my family member. But I spared you that, even though it technically is dinner time. But yeah, so anyways, that's all I have. But if you have questions, I'd be happy to engage in discussion with you.